So Jacques graduated from Davidson. You can see his name tag there, North Carolina Epsilon, in 1990, and then got his MBA from Villanova. After graduating, he spent 9 years on SigEp's headquarters staff, starting as a regional director, which many headquarters staff members do, and then worked his way up to executive director. Jacques also currently serves on a member of SigEp's investment committee, so that's really important work that he still continues to do for the fraternity. But professionally, he went on to spend quite a bit of time in a number of sales and finance-related roles at Campbell's Soup Company, and then has been at Vanguard over the last 8 years as a finance director. And as he described it to me when we were prepping, he basically does what a VP of finance does, just at Vanguard on a little different scale. So we're really pumped to have you, Jacques, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Zach. Appreciate it. And it is great to be here with this group. The funny thing is that there are so many people on this call that could lead this session, and many of you actually formed my thinking over time. So I'm looking at Steve Buse on the screen and Dave Hewlett and so many other volunteers I got to work with during my time on staff in the 90s, which is fantastic. So good to see some familiar faces. And then for the undergraduates, I really look forward to spending some time with you tonight. I'm going to take a quick spin through an agenda, but your questions are equally as important. So as you have time to put them in the chat, please do. I'm getting a nice private chat from my old roommate, Fred Herberg, who's on the call. So I'd really like to get some more things in the chat that are public, questions you guys have that Vice Presidents of Finance want to know about. So let me get started. As Zach said, I graduated from Davidson in 1991 and joined SigEp in 1987. My big brother in the chapter really introduced me to the national fraternity. So when I joined North Carolina Epsilon, we were not that engaged nationally with SigEp, but I was very fortunate to have my big brother be Jay Hurt. Jay is very involved with the foundation these days. Jay was a student national director, and he and I are fortunate to have lifelong friendships, and that's been great. And then since I've joined the staff, I mentioned Fred Herberg. Fred and I were actually regional directors together. He from Johns Hopkins, I from Davidson, and then we went on to live together for 3 years on the staff. So that is certainly one of the things I want to leave you with, is those connections, those lifelong friendships really are what we're here for. And then when the tough times come, like they are right now, those friendships do matter even more. All right, let me talk a little bit about the Vice President of Finance role. So first of all, I have up on the screen there, if you're a Vice President of Finance, you're really a leader first within the chapter and you're a VP of Finance second. I really think of the exec board as that group that's got to stick together and lead the chapter. I was exchanging a couple emails recently with Ken Maddox. Ken's a former executive director of the fraternity, graduate of Oregon State University, my first boss and one of my mentors still today. And Ken was sent us, a bunch of us, a recommendation for a podcast. And that podcast was called Hope Through History. And the specific episode he referenced was episode number 2, all about Churchill. And as I listened to that podcast, then I got thinking about the session today, I thought how appropriate Churchill's 3 key characteristics were during World War II as he led Great Britain through the fight against the Nazis. But those 3 characteristics are super important for all leaders as you go through any tough time. And Churchill's 3 characteristics were courage, candor, and cooperation, as you can see on the screen there. And I think as VPs of Finance, you have to have courage. And I'm going to talk more about what that looks like in a minute. You have to have candor. We have to be willing to talk about the fact that this is a tough time. I currently serve as a volunteer when I can to the guys at Villanova that are just up the street from me, Pennsylvania Row. And I serve as a sounding board to some of the undergraduates. And it's a tough time for them right now in recruitment. It's a tough time for them on why should we charge dues? Why should we collect dues when we're in a largely remote environment? And having that candor with the undergraduates about what it takes to keep a chapter going through this when we all have to make sacrifices, and just being upfront and honest about that's important. And then lastly, it talked about Churchill really emphasizing cooperation. He really studied his allies. He really thought about how to engage them well. And as a leader within that chapter, you've really got to hold the chapter together. You got to be the glue to encourage cooperation during these tough times, in whatever form that takes. And then lastly, I just thought I'd share a couple examples that I had seen during my time with the fraternity about when, during tough times, undergraduates did step up and lead. I was fortunate as an undergraduate to travel to Oklahoma Beta, which is the University of Oklahoma. And if you ever go there, you will hear them talk about the Mag 7. And the Mag 7 are the 7 undergraduates who were there when that chapter, which is historically over 100 men, fell on tough times and went down to 7 men. And these 7 undergraduates kept the chapter going and really caused it to turn around and to flourish into what has been a long-term great chapter for SigEp. And then Penn Delta is the other one. University of Pennsylvania is near and dear to my heart. And I was recently, talking with Zach, and we were discussing sort of tough times that chapters have gone through. And Penn Delta is one that has really recorded their history well. And if you read the history books about Penn Delta during World War II, they were actually down to 3 undergraduates. And those 3 undergraduates had to see them through some really tough times as they came through and made it. And those undergraduates stepped up and really led and formed what has now been there for generations at Penn Delta. And then lastly, Fred will appreciate this. I had a good friend, we both do have a good friend, Ari Rosenbaum, who served as regional director with us. And I remember getting a voicemail from him because that was before computers when we were on the road as regional directors. I remember getting a voicemail from Ari one night saying he had rolled into Missouri New, St. Louis University, and we were down to 3 undergraduates there as well. And he was trying to figure out what to do. He did a great job inspiring those guys. We had some wonderful local volunteers, and that chapter at Missouri New grew, and it grew out to more than 50 men out of just a group of 3. So, 3 just quick anecdotes there that this can be done. These tough times happen to every chapter. And I just want you to take inspiration from those that have come before you. All right. Again, I'd really encourage you to put any leadership related questions in the chat, but I'm now going to switch to tips for success as the VP of Finance, which is really the second important piece of your role on the exec board. Leader first, VP of Finance second. As a VP of Finance, I'd really encourage you to work with your resources that you have available to you. I just put them on the screen here. Your volunteers, your district governor, your headquarters. Now are the time more than ever to form a partnership with them. Please don't try to do it all yourself, I wrote here. And I really mean that. I think too often undergraduates think they can do it all themselves and think they should do it all themselves. And for one reason or another, are a little hesitant to enroll those volunteers. And, that's okay from time to time, but I will tell you that chapters that are long-term healthy chapters have great local volunteers. I've been saying that for the, however many years I've been involved as volunteer. And I learned that my first day on the Richmond staff in 1991. Anybody that came in to talk to us would tell us the exact same thing. And I was fortunate to learn from one of the best. One of my great volunteers at North Carolina Epsilon was a guy named Frank Rader. Frank was a graduate at Davidson College, varsity football player, varsity wrestler, and one of the things he enjoyed most was being a volunteer for SigEp and teaching undergraduates like myself how to lead. And he kept the books for that alumni board for many, many years, went on to receive the Order of the Golden Heart, and unfortunately he passed away not too long ago. So please use those resources that are available to you. The other thing I will say is, more than ever now, you also want to lean into the campus resources available to you. Whether that's the Greek advisor, whether that's faculty members that take an interest in you as a person, it doesn't matter. We need to show our partnership as undergraduate chapters more than ever with university administrations. It's easy to point the finger at fraternities, and certainly I've read the headlines. You guys have all read the headlines about social distancing and fraternities. Look, we have a chance to prove that wrong. And one of the ways we prove that wrong is through good quality relationships with the right people in the university administration. So please, as VP of Finance, make it a part of your role to reach out and talk to those folks. Super important. All right. So now that you have the right support network in place, whether it be your local volunteers, your district governor, your headquarters staff, or your local campus resources, what can you do? And to me, I like a simple checklist because I'm a simple guy. Otherwise, I get confused very easily. So as an undergraduate VP of Finance, I don't think this is super, what's the old expression? It's simple, but it's not easy. So I don't think this work is easy. I don't want you to hear that. But I do think at the end of the day, it's relatively simple. And like Zach said, I currently work in the area of financial planning and analysis at Vanguard. And I do what you guys do, like I said, just on a little different scale right now. But the first thing you got to do, understand your budget from last year, and in a normal year, what does it look like? I will say, if you're unhoused, this can be pretty easy. If you have a house and you used to have a meal plan, it can be pretty complicated. You know, I referred to Oklahoma Beta. When I traveled there, they had 83 men living in a chapter house with a full-time meal program and a couple full-time employees. That undergraduate VP of Finance was doing a real tough job. And I can only imagine what that's like now, trying to manage through COVID as well. That's why you got to use your resources. But once you understand that budget from last year, then you figure out, what do you do? What do you need to change? When you figure that out, go ahead and set your dues. Do you want to keep them the same? Do you need to reduce them? How do you think about that? Maybe you've got to go to your alumni and find out if there are resources to cover some of the shortfalls this year. You certainly want to understand what the headquarters staff has done for you, which is reduce the dues this year, so you can talk to undergraduates about how people are trying to help our chapters. And then finally, you want to lean in to see if the school can help you out. So set your dues, but look around to see if there are other ways that we can offset revenue shortfalls. Then lastly, collect dues in this space, right? And this is not easy too with people virtually. I want to just talk for a minute about that though. You have to get creative here. And also, you just have to be willing to take a stand. Granted, I'm going to share an anecdote from you from an in-person story, but when I did travel as a regional director, I remember traveling to the University of Texas, Texas Alpha. I showed up, the VP of Finance said, I have a problem. We've got $40,000 worth of dues outstanding, and we have to pay our mortgage, and I don't know how to collect this stuff. So we were going to dinner that night, and I said, well, it's pretty simple to me. Do all your guys eat? They're like, yeah, we have a good chef, and everybody shows up to eat. And I said, really? Even people who haven't paid, do they eat? He said, yeah, they eat. I said, okay, we're going to stand by the plates tonight. And if people haven't written you a check yet, then they don't get a plate, and they don't get to eat tonight. And we'll see what happens. He collected $15,000 in one meal, just because it was easy for people not to pay. They were just going through the motions, and they were following the path of least resistance. So was that hard? Yeah, it was hard for him. Like, he was like, could you stand here with me while we do this? And I said, sure. But at the end of the day, he asked the question, he did all of that, and nobody got in his face. They understood. So as a VP of Finance, what I am saying is, you've got to be the one to stand up. You've got to be the one to just help people understand that we have to have money to run a chapter, even during tough times like this, and we need you to pay your dues on time. How you do that in a virtual environment, I'm happy to brainstorm. I don't have any great ideas for you. All right, last couple things, and then we'll take some questions. So reconcile books in your bank account monthly. Cash is critical. I don't think any of that's a secret to anybody, but in tough times, cash is critical more than ever. You got to make sure you have enough cash to pay your bills. You got to make sure you got enough cash that's going to be coming in future months to pay any bills. And you got to reconcile your books so you understand what invoices have you not received yet. Do you have enough cash to cover those? Are you reconciling your bank statements? However you choose to do that. And please sit down and do that work monthly. You can't get behind on that. Too many undergraduate chapters. It's super easy to go study for your exam because that's what you should be doing. It's super easy to write the paper, but you got to sit down once a month and do the reconciliations. It's really important. Financial controls are still important. That means sit down with a volunteer. It means sit down with somebody on campus and have them be your second set of eyes. You know, if you're writing checks or making payments, you want somebody to know what checks you've written. You want somebody to know what payments you've made, whether that's the chapter president, whether that's somebody else on the executive board. That four-eye check, as I like to refer to it, is just really important from a financial control perspective, just for your own safety and security as an undergraduate. You never want your integrity questioned about any money that's outflowing from the chapter. So financial controls remain important. I do, especially if you have a house and a meal plan and larger amounts of money running through, getting your books audited in some way every year is super important, because you want to be able to hand over to the next VP of Finance a clean set of books. Just like when you're walking in the door as a new VP of Finance, you want to know you're getting a clean set of books. All right, and then lastly, a quick word about the IRS. So many of you know the IRS is doing lots of work about the tax status of nonprofit groups right now, and specifically around fraternities and sororities. Fraternities enjoy a special tax status. The national fraternity is a 501c7. That gives us certain tax advantages. I'm not a tax expert, consult one. I know Chuck Stegman is doing a tremendous amount of work for the fraternity in this space, and I can't thank him enough for the effort that he's giving. Our chapters locally also have a special IRS status. The problem is you got to keep it up every year. And too many of our chapters are not filing on an annual basis. And I'm just here, whether you're watching this as a recording or you're with us live today, to ask you to please make sure you've got your tax status in order. Of course, you might be thinking, well, Jacques, how do I know? I'm going to go back to bullet point 1 on that. Ask your volunteers, ask your district governor, talk to the headquarters staff. They're all resources available to you to make sure we have this thing in order. And I'm the first one to say, I'm not a great leader on this with the Pennsylvania Row Alumni Corporation, and I'm going to fix that within the next 45 days. So those of you who don't know if you're behind or not behind, you're likely behind if you don't know. So ask the question, go get it done, and get it fixed. And if you're on an AVC, go ask the question also. All right, that's my public service announcement about the IRS. I'm also happy to take questions about that. So with that, I'm going to pause. Please, we don't have a big ton of people on the call. So if you have a question, please feel free to take yourself off of mute and ask the question, or feel free to put it in the chat. And I'm going to pause for a minute to see if any questions come through. All right, I've got a couple of questions coming through in the chat that are not public. So let me try to take one or two of those along the way. Number one is a great question that I've heard more times than I really want to hear. The previous VP of Finance didn't help me transition into the role. How do I help the next guy hit the ground running? First of all, love that attitude. Whoever asked that question, thank you for wanting to help the next guy. I do see it all too often. The previous guy left me a mess of books and I don't know how to make my way through it. What do I do? So I'd say the first thing is, you know, you're coming up on many of you on the end of your tenure right now. The first thing you can do is get the books in order. Hand off something, whether that's in Quicken or whether it's on the back of a napkin. I don't really care, but it has to be in order. Preferably it's in a system somewhere. Preferably you're handing off something that is sort of well thought out and people know who owes, what do they owe. who are the key bills that you pay? You know, what does my 12-month rolling budget looks like? What have you thought about for the future? What are the issues going on? And please, please sit down and have that conversation. Really talk up through all of it and be there for an hour or 2 hours to answer all the questions along the way. And then lastly, I talked about the 4-eyed check. Don't hand it over and walk out the door metaphorically. You know, too many exec board officers, when they're done, they sort of wipe their brow and go, phew, I'm out of that role now. Be there for the new person. You know, go through that first month, sit down with that first month at the end of that first month and go through the books together so that you can work through it hand in hand or, you know, over Zoom together now and really make sure it's in good shape. And I want to thank Mike Donnan, who talks about sharing his transition guide if it helps. You know, I think that is certainly one of the ways that the fraternity works best is when we all share great ideas with each other. As I said earlier, I've learned from many volunteers on this call, just some of the many thoughts I shared with you guys today. So thanks, Mike, for that. Any other questions on transition? I think the number one thing you can do, get the books in good order before you hand them off. I've just had too many horror stories of them not being in good order before they're handed off. Lastly, I will say, and I've lived through this, the other really, really important part of the transition, if you have a checking account, is getting to the bank and signing over the signatures, right? Taking the old person off as a signatory, putting the new person on as a signatory is a super important thing, and making sure the signatories are right. The last thing you want is somebody sitting out there authorized who was VP of Finance 4 years ago, still as an authorized signatory on any bank account that belongs to the undergraduate chapter. It's just not good financial controls. All right, I'm going to pause, see if there are any questions coming through.
Jacques, I've got a question for you. I love the approach of the Vice President of Finance and really anybody on an executive board as a leader first, and particularly with the Churchill approach of courage, candor, and cooperation. What other leadership values, tactics, and concepts do you apply in your work that would directly impact how an undergraduate can approach that role, you know, in the day-to-day, in the planning for a year, and even in a transition period that we're about to come to pretty soon?
Yeah, Sean, it's a really good question. And I think, shoot, as any exec board member, as an undergraduate, you are learning leadership lessons that are going to stick with you throughout your life. So kudos to you for raising your hand and taking on that role. You know, I would say that that notion of being upfront about where the chapter is financially with the entire chapter is just important. Candor, as you know, as I refer to as one of those 3 traits, is something that I just can't talk enough about. I think too many undergraduates, Vice President of Finance, bear that burden of where are we financially on their own or with the chapter president or with the exec board. And I think you got to open it up to the chapter and say, guys, here's where we are. You know, if New Jersey Alpha and Steve Buse, if we can't fill that chapter house because people are living from home, we got to be upfront about the finances with the undergraduates. And what is it going to take just to keep us afloat this year? And if there are alumni who step forward and help out just so we can stay afloat this year, it's sharing with the rest of the chapter those stories. So I like, you know, I'm probably a product of Ken Maddox in this regard from the fraternity, but Ken talked a lot about leadership as storytelling. And I think as a VP of Finance, we're really good with numbers, and sometimes we latch onto those numbers, but I think telling the story is equally important from a leadership perspective, Sean.
Thank you for that.
All right, Billy, I've got something here. I've been rebuilding our chapter financially over the past year and a half as VP of Finance. Now 7,000 in checking, 7,000 in savings. First of all, great work, fantastic. With coronavirus now, though, many of our members have lost jobs, absolutely, or can't find new ones. even set up a payment plan, but some cannot even pay that. Look, I think this is where we balance candor and compassion. You know, we used to have sort of the standards board, or our AVC also used to say, if you're having trouble paying your bill, you can come to the AVC and talk about why. I think it's super important not to shame people, but to help people come forward if they can't pay and have an avenue to talk about why they should remain in the chapter. And frankly, as Vice President of Finance, you know your brothers, you know the ones that you shouldn't kick out because they can't pay. You know the ones you want to go to your alumni volunteers and go, hey, can you pay half their dues this semester and we'll give them a break on the other half so we can keep them on the chapter rolls because they're the right guy. And then you know the guys who are just saying, sorry, I can't pay, I don't want to pay, right? And that's basically what they're saying is they don't want to pay. They have the ability to pay, they're just not paying. You know who those guys are too? And those are the guys we got to keep to our standards on. And I would say that as a VP of Finance, in some regards, that is one of your roles as, what's the word I want to use? You're kind of the conscience of the chapter in that regard. You got to enroll the chaplain in that. You got to enroll the standards board in that. But I know certainly at Pennsylvania Row at Villanova, when an undergraduate comes forward and has a story that makes sense and is a hardship story, and then I work with the VP of Finance to really check that story, we find a way as alumni to keep that person in the chapter. We figure it out. Okay. The other thing I'd say about savings is it's probably the time, unfortunately, to dip into savings. Like, you know, we're in a COVID-19 situation. We're in a hardship situation. This is probably, you know, if you can build your savings in this time, kudos to you. I don't think many chapters are in that situation right now. And so we save for a rainy day for a reason. And for many chapters, this is going to be that rainy day. What else can I answer, guys? Anybody?
Yeah, I'd be interested in learning some more of the tips of the trade, like the one you mentioned earlier about asking guys to buy their dinner plate. Any others from the group that might have some suggestions, little tips that they could pass on to their VP of Finance?
I'll share one. When I first got involved with University of California at Berkeley, California Alpha, I was asked to just audit the existing VPF. There was no thought there was anything wrong. It was just nobody on the ABC at the time had a background in numbers. And so I looked at his spreadsheet, and the first thing I'll say, it was the most beautiful spreadsheet I have ever seen, purple and red everywhere. But as I looked through it, I started discovering that some of the logic was wrong. And it was literally about this time and that year when that happened, and he was going out of office in 60 days. And when he left office, 40% of the annual income for the chapter was uncollected. They had no idea what bills they had. They didn't have they hadn't paid the mortgage in months. And they had no records of who'd paid housing deposits. They had spent all their housing deposits on parties, and nobody knew that except the president and the VPF. And this new guy came in with no experience whatsoever, managing a $500,000 a year budget. It was a 80, 90 man chapter in a 20, 30 man house at the time. And the thing he did that worked really fabulously for him is he just pulled out the bylaws with the 30-60 plans and started enforcing that with the help. He got the rest of the execs on board. And within literally a couple months, the ARs had dropped to nothing. They were caught up on their rent. So I think part of it is just back to basics of following. That's what I took from him. And also he transitioned from a spreadsheet-based system that had lots of flaws into what then LegFi, what would now be Greek Bill. And so now I can look back at the finances from those years if I need to look up something for a question from the IRS or whatever, and that's really been a big help. So it was, I wouldn't say there was any magic to it, but it was partly the teamwork that was talked about of getting the rest of the execs on board with him, and then just going back to basics and following the 30-60 policy.
Yeah, so Chuck, thank you for sharing that. You prompted three things in my head as you were talking there. One is, as you guys are going through this, the biggest gift you can give your next VP of Finance is a clean accounts receivable sheet, having nobody owing money to the chapter. It's by far the biggest gift you can give, because you'll be ending a semester, going into a new one, and if the new VP of Finance has to collect stuff from this first semester and figure out how to be a VP of Finance, they're 2 steps behind already. The second thing Chuck mentioned is some of the services out there right now that can do billing on your behalf. Chuck, you mentioned one of them. I don't know, the names all escape me. Greek Bill, I think, is one of them.
Yeah, that's the one we're using now, we're recommending now.
I think that's up to you as a VP of Finance. If you have an unhoused chapter and you're in the middle of a crisis right now, maybe the last thing you want to do is sort of pay a third party on top of the dues, because you've just now added things to people's dues that they have to pay. At the same time, it may be exactly the right time to do it. So I'm going to really encourage you to be thoughtful about that for your chapter. And I see Steve Buse shaking his head yes.
I'm going to chime in a second. Go on.
And then for those of you who don't have a service, and Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about a service, because I think you'll be much more well-spoken about it than I am. But for those of you who don't have a service, I know Villanova's tried to make it as easy as possible for undergraduates to pay their dues. And so they've even used a Venmo account for people to pay their dues. I would just be careful with that. I think my concern with our VP of Finance right now is really understanding the money flow in and out of any account like that. So if you're allowing people to pay their dues through Venmo, it is really back to having good financial controls and having really strong reconciliations on a regular basis become even more important. I get you want to make it easy, but I also know that stuff makes it harder to go through one centralized account that people are paying into. So Steve, I want to turn it over to you.
So my home chapter uses Quicken as their tool for collections. And one of the things we sold, or one of the ways we sold that in a sense, is in the making it easier point of view. Yeah, they're going to collect a fee. It accounts, if 3%, so maybe it's 1 out of 30 is the way to look at that. If you get one extra person out of 30 members to pay, you've already broken even. And if you get 2 extra guys out of 30, then it was a good investment. So think of it from that angle, that the fee that you're coughing up to the service company is probably worth your while in most cases. And in our case, we're using it for collecting dues in particular. Our housing is done. And actually, we're with SENH for housing on that side. But it's it's also made the VPF job a lot easier for our guys over the last 5 to 10 years that they've been using that tool. And they won't go. I mean, once in a while, they make sure that Quicken is still a good deal. They've changed companies once or twice, but they will never go back to doing it from scratch, at least in our case.
And again, I would say if you want to learn more, the headquarters staff is a great one resource for that. Your local volunteers. I see Billy is saying they use Greek Bill. And I think that, one of the great things about that also is I talked about the IRS briefly, mentioned a word about the IRS. Many of these companies now are trying to incorporate that filing into their service. And it's just a good way to keep up to date with the IRS without having to worry about it. I certainly know I'm no expert. I want to be able to set it and forget it on some of that sort of stuff if I can. Good to hear from Sebastian, my home chapter, near and dear to my heart. Thanks for chiming in that you do not, because Davidson collects dues for us. That sounds a lot like the Davidson I know and love. So great to hear that.
Hey, Jacques, I got one more question for you, and maybe related to more of your kind of professional expertise as well. And then maybe we can split off or just have the guys come off mute and talk amongst themselves too, and maybe share some ideas. At a time where it feels like we're pivoting or we're coming up with new ideas or new ways to do business or to really stay alive, how has Vanguard evolved or adapted, and maybe even the people that have struggled with that, how do you bring them along? How do you get them to come along with you and deal with the change? And that's a big leadership lesson that all of our officers are probably going to have to deal with maybe multiple times this year.
Yeah, great questions. One is, the first thing I would say is talk through some scenarios. We talk through a lot of scenarios, when our revenue is based on our assets under management at Vanguard. And so if the market goes down significantly, all of a sudden we lose a huge chunk of our revenue as a company. And that happened. You guys know that. It happened in the March, April timeframe. And we did a lot of scenario planning. I was busy for quite a while thinking through, what are we going to do if this happens? What are we going to do if that happens? We've been very fortunate. I will say that the market has bounced back and we haven't had to pull a lot of those levers, but we practice that. We practice that scenario planning to keep that muscle fresh so that when stuff does happen, we know what we're going to do. So practice scenarios. What happens if we are able to come back to campus in the spring? What happens if we have to remain remote in the spring? What do we do if we can't recruit for a whole year? Because now we're going to have 2 years of guys that we could potentially get new members from, which I look at that as an opportunity versus a threat. But you have to kind of look at it from the positive side of things. So one is scenario plan, Zach. Two is, find the positive in that. Like, I think you gotta motivate people as you talk about to keep grinding with you, and what I would say is, what are the things that you're not taking advantage of with the national fraternity? I am shocked at how many undergraduates I talk to that don't know the national fraternity offers scholarships, don't know the national fraternity offers sessions like this, don't know about the RUC program, don't understand about how cool it is to go to Conclave and see 1,000 of your friends that I now have seen over many, many, many years. They don't understand the power of networking, right? I had a guy, I believe his name is Adam Katz, email me out of the blue today. He saw me, I was going to do this. He's graduating from Duke this year. And he said, hey, I just finished my interview for the rotational program at Vanguard. And I'd love to talk to you more about the company. Can we talk on Saturday? So he and I are going to talk on Saturday, which is great. I've never met Adam, but look forward to talking to him. He found my Vanguard email address and sent me an email, and it was great to hear from him. So, I think all of those lifelong things, you really got to lean in these situations as a leader and help the undergraduates know that we're much bigger. This whole thing is much bigger than the myopic situation we're in right now on our campus. It feels really hard. Like, if we just get through this, and we will, the opportunities available to you and the difference it makes in your life as a person, and the fraternity's made a ton of difference in my life, is much, much greater than going through the year we're going to be going through here. That takes a real leader to talk about it in that way, though. And that's hard as an undergraduate to do that. I don't want to, say it's easy. It's not.
Jacques, Adam is actually listening. He's on the call here. He's listening in, maybe getting a little bit of pre-call with you before your phone call individually on Saturday. So that's awesome.
Nice.
In the network, that's cool.
Nice. I'm glad I got his name, hopefully, right. That's good. Sorry if I messed up your last name, Adam. I was on the fly today.
Good stuff.
Any other questions, guys, before we open it up? This has been great. I got to jump to be with my family here, but absolutely want to take any last questions before I go. And, you know, Ken, my wife is a proud graduate of the Darden School of Business, so glad to see UVA represented on the call tonight. That's awesome.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. It's great to be here.
You know, I often think about, like, what does success look like from a session like this? And to me, it's two things. One is that you all have heard the message that there are a lot of people here to help you. You know, I want to continue the dialogue. You can reach me through Zach. You can reach me through Sean. They have my contact information. I'm happy for them to share it. Want to make sure I get that on the recording. And then to me, the other success is in however many years it is, because I don't think I can do the math quickly enough in my head, but I want to see one of the undergraduates on this call participating as a volunteer, like Steve Buse, like Chuck Stegman, like Frank Herbert, all those people that I have looked up to and worked with as fellow volunteers. I want to see you as a volunteer on this call, whether it's 10, 20 years from now, giving back in the same way that these amazing volunteers are giving back today. So that's what success looks like to me, and it's been great to be with you guys.